He worked hard, not for himself, but for the smiles he came home to a middle-class father, quietly carrying the weight of dreams he could never afford for himself. Tonight, close your eyes, relax your mind, and let's walk through the quiet, emotional journey of a man whose story is never told aloud, but always felt deep inside. If you find peace in stories that touch the heart, and if you'd like to hear more soul-soothing tales like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you stories that comfort your soul and calm your nights. It was 6:15 in the morning when Thomas woke up, as he did every single day, even on Sundays. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock and the occasional sigh of the wind brushing against the windows. He moved slowly, carefully, so he wouldn't wake his wife, Laura, or their 2 children, Emily and Jake. The small home they lived in was warm but tight, and every creak of the floor felt louder than it should be. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and took a long breath. His back ached the way it always did after a long shift at the warehouse. He didn't complain, never did. It wasn't because he had no pain, but because he knew there was no space for complaint in a life that demanded more than it gave. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of instant coffee, and stared at the small calendar on the wall. Another month. Another stack of bills. But also another month closer to Jake's school trip, which he had promised to pay for. Jake had been saving from his lunch money. Thomas saw it, the way his son folded each dollar into the envelope hidden inside his school bag. It broke his heart, not because Jake was saving, but because he had to. The bus ride to work was always quiet. Thomas liked it that way. He stared out the window, watching the sleepy town wake up, brick by brick, window by window. He thought about the roof that needed fixing, the shoes Emily had outgrown, the car insurance he had delayed again. But then he remembered the way Laura smiled at dinner last night, tired but grateful. That one moment made every burden feel lighter. At the warehouse, Thomas wore his worn-out gloves, pulled his cap low, and blended into a crowd of people who looked just like him, hardworking, quiet, and barely making it. There were no grand rewards at the end of his shift, no applause. Just the knowledge that he had shown up again like he always did. And that was enough for him. When he returned home that evening, Emily ran to him, wrapping her little arms around his waist. Her joy, so simple and pure, melted every ounce of fatigue inside him. They sat together on the floor, drawing with broken crayons, making stories out of scribbles. Laura made spaghetti, and Jake helped set the table. It wasn't perfect, but it was love. It was home. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas stood alone in the backyard, looking up at the sky. The stars didn't shine brighter for him, but he smiled anyway. Not because life was easy, but because he knew he was giving everything he had for the people he loved. And though no one saw his quiet sacrifices, they existed in every warm meal, every paid school fee, every bedtime hug. He was a middle-class father, and that was his quiet, beautiful strength. The next morning came with a gentle mist hanging over the backyard. Thomas stood by the kitchen window, his calloused hands wrapped around a warm coffee mug. He looked out, not really at anything, just into the soft gray of the sky. The kind of silence that asked nothing and offered calm. He cherished these few minutes before the world pulled him back into routine. Lavra joined him, still in her robe, hair tied messily, eyes soft with sleep. She leaned on his shoulder and whispered, "You're doing great." He didn't answer. He just smiled faintly, as if that moment filled a space inside him no one could see. That one sentence, that quiet acknowledgement, meant more to him than 1,000 loud praises ever could. Thomas left for work again, walking past familiar corners of their neighborhood. The cracked pavement, the tired trees, the same mailbox with peeling paint. It was all old, but it was theirs. He didn't crave mansions or fancy cars. He craved stability, peace, a little space where his family could be safe and dream freely. At the warehouse, the air was cold and metallic. Machines roared, and the smell of dust and oil filled every breath. Thomas moved with rhythm, stacking boxes, checking orders, lifting weight his bones didn't agree with. He never rushed. He had learned to be patient, to outlast tiredness, to pace himself like a long-distance runner who never gets to rest but never stops. During lunch break, he sat on a crate and pulled out a sandwich Laura had packed, peanut butter and jelly, simple and familiar. There was a note folded beside it, written in Emily's handwriting. It said, "Thank you for everything, Daddy. You're my hero." His eyes welled up before he could finish the sandwich. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his wallet where he kept other little things. Jake's drawing of their house, a photo of Laura from their early days, and a grocery receipt with a heart doodled on the back. These were his treasures, priceless, quiet reminders of a life built on love, not luxury. Evening brought more than fatigue that day. Jake had been quiet at dinner, barely touching his food. Thomas noticed but waited until later to speak. When the house dimmed and the others were asleep, he sat beside his son on the edge of his bed. Jake finally whispered, "Dad, I don't think I can go on the trip. It costs too much." Thomas looked at him, heart aching. "Why do you think that?" Jake hesitated. "I saw the electric bill on the table, and I know Mom didn't buy her new coat this winter." Thomas smiled gently and placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. "Listen to me. You don't carry that weight. That's not your job. Let me be the father, all right?" Jake nodded, eyes wet. "I'll figure it out," Thomas said, and meant it with every inch of his tired soul. Later that night, Thomas sat with Laura at the kitchen table. They looked at the bills, the budget, the fading ink on the calendar. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. She placed her hand over his, and they sat like that for a long time, together in the quiet facing life's noise. That night, as he lay in bed, Thomas thought about his father. A man of few words, but much strength. He now understood what he hadn't as a child, that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in work boots, in grocery bags, in the creak of the door that opens after a long day. His eyes slowly closed, not from exhaustion, but from the warmth of knowing that even though he had little, he had everything that mattered. Part 3. The morning sun slipped through the curtains, painting soft lines across the wooden floor of their small bedroom. Thomas blinked his eyes open, the weight of another day settling on his chest like a familiar coat. But today felt heavier, not because of work, but because he had made a promise to send Jake on that trip, no matter what it took. He quietly dressed, kissed Laura's forehead, and left before the rest of the house stirred. The town was waking slowly. Thomas walked a little faster than usual. He wasn't heading to the warehouse, not yet. He had picked up an extra job cleaning floors at a diner before his main shift. 2 hours. Just enough to fill in the gap that separated dreams from reality. The manager at the diner was kind, but the work was rough. Thomas scrubbed, wiped, and swept while the city outside stretched into motion. The clatter of dishes, the chatter of early risers, it all blurred as he focused on one thing, that envelope in Jake's backpack. He wanted to fill it with hope. When he arrived at the warehouse after, his legs already ached, but no one knew. Thomas smiled like always, nodded to the others, and got to work. He moved slower that day, but with more purpose. His mind wasn't on the clock. It was on his son, on that school bus that would leave in 2 weeks, and how he had to make sure Jake would be on it, smiling and unaware of what it had cost. During break, he received a text from Laura. It simply read, "Emily's got a cold. I might take her to the clinic." He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath that felt heavier than the boxes he carried all morning. Healthcare wasn't something they could easily afford, but Thomas never said no when his family needed care. He would find a way. He always did. Back home that evening, Emily sat curled up on the couch with a blanket and a stuffed bunny. Her cheeks were flushed and her voice was soft. Thomas knelt beside her, brushing her hair from her forehead. "You're my sunshine," he whispered. "I don't feel very sunny," she said, sniffling. "You don't have to be. Daddy will shine for you today." Lavra watched from the kitchen, eyes tired but filled with love. They didn't speak much that night. Some nights didn't need words, just shared glances. Just the soft clink of dishes being washed and the hum of the heater trying to keep the house warm. When the children slept, Thomas opened his wallet and looked at the note from Emily again, then at the bills, then at the small cash he had tucked away from the diner shift. It wasn't enough yet, but it would be. He believed in slow, steady steps, in showing up even when no one clapped. Later, lying in bed beside Laura, he stared at the ceiling in silence. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm tired," he answered honestly. "You always are." He turned to face her, eyes soft, "But I'm never empty." She reached for his hand, and he held it like it was the only thing keeping him from sinking. That night, Thomas dreamed not of rest, but of Jake laughing on a school bus, of Emily running through spring grass, of Laura smiling without worry. These dreams were his fuel. They didn't cost money, but they were worth everything. As the house slept around him, Thomas knew tomorrow he would rise again, without complaint, without reward, because love, for him, was not a grand gesture. It was in the small things, the quiet things, the things no one saw, but everything depended on. A light drizzle tapped gently against the windows the next morning. The sky was gray, the kind that made people want to stay in bed a little longer. But Thomas was already dressed, sipping lukewarm coffee in the kitchen as the clock neared 5:45. He was tired, yes, but there was something steady in his movements, like a rhythm learned over years of rising before the sun. Emily's fever had gone down slightly, and Lavra had taken the day off from her part-time job at the library to stay home with her. They exchanged quiet words in the kitchen, soft and short, just enough to share thoughts without disturbing the stillness of the morning. "I might have to skip groceries this week," Lara said, folding a list she had written the night before. Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll stretch what we've got." She looked at him. "You always say that, and somehow we always do." He smiled gently. "That's because we stretch together." Before heading out, he kissed Emily's forehead and whispered something only she could hear. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made the entire morning worth it. At the diner, Thomas worked his quiet magic again. No one noticed the man scrubbing the floor by the coffee machines. They sipped, laughed, tapped their phones. He didn't need attention. He only needed the extra $20 he'd earned today. 20 closer to Jake's trip. 20 closer to being a father who kept his word. Back at the warehouse, his shift was longer than usual. Someone had called in sick, so Thomas stayed an extra hour. His hands moved slower by evening, his back stiff and sore. Still, he didn't stop. Every box lifted felt like a silent promise kept. Every step taken on that concrete floor was for someone he loved. The sun was already setting when he boarded the bus home. The sky outside burned orange and slowly turned purple. He watched it change through the foggy window, his reflection faintly visible over the city lights. At home, he was greeted by something unexpected: laughter. Not the tired kind that came after long days, but the joyful kind that spilled out without effort. Jake was showing Emily how to fold paper cranes, and she giggled with each one that collapsed in her hands. Lara looked up from the stove and met his eyes. "You're just in time," she said, lifting the pot lid to reveal a stew that smelled like comfort. He set down his bag and joined them, soaking in the warmth, not just of the food, but of the moment. After dinner, Jake pulled him aside. "Dad, I didn't know you were working another job." Thomas froze for a second, surprised. "I saw the shoes near the back door," Jake said. "They're wet every morning, even before you leave for the warehouse." Thomas sighed. You weren't supposed to know. Jake looked up at him, eyes full of something heavier than his age. I want to help too. Thomas knelt in front of him, his voice low and full of feeling. Jake, your job is to be a kid. To learn, to dream, to mess up, and try again. Let me carry this. That's what I'm here for. Jake nodded slowly, but in that moment, a kind of respect passed between them. The quiet, deep kind that only grows between two people who understand sacrifice. Later that night, Thomas sat in the living room, alone, the envelope for the school trip finally full in his hands. He had done it, dollar by dollar, day by day, without telling anyone. Without expecting anything in return, he didn't cry. He just sat still, overwhelmed by a feeling no words could hold. A simple envelope, a simple promise, a quiet victory. And as the rain soughed outside, Thomas leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and let the silence wrap around him like a blanket. He didn't need the world to applaud. His family's laughter was enough. Their warmth was his reward. Their happiness, his purpose. Part 5. The morning light peeked gently through the curtains, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas didn't wake up before his alarm. The house was still quiet, but something about the air felt lighter, as if the weight he'd been quietly carrying for weeks had finally eased just enough to let his shoulders rest. He stretched slowly, feeling every joint, every ache, but he smiled. Today wasn't just another work day. It was the day Jake would leave for his school trip. A small event in the world, perhaps, but for Thomas, it felt like everything. Downstairs, Jake was already dressed, his bag packed and shoes neatly tied. He was trying to act normal, but the excitement in his eyes betrayed him. Laura was packing a few last-minute snacks, while Emily, still recovering, sat on the couch with her favorite blanket, waving a tiny homemade flag that read, "Have fun, Jake." Thomas handed Jake the envelope with the trip money. He had written Jake's name on it in careful letters. Jake took it slowly, holding it like something sacred. "You sure we can afford this, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas crouched in front of him. "It's already paid for, son. All you have to do is enjoy it, make memories, take pictures, laugh with your friends. That's your job today." Jake nodded, eyes misty, trying not to show too much emotion. He hugged his father tightly, and Thomas held him a second longer than usual. At the bus stop, a group of excited kids chattered and laughed, while parents stood nearby, waving and giving last-minute reminders. Thomas and Laura stood behind Jake, hands gently touching, watching him board the bus. As it pulled away, Jake leaned out the window, waving with both arms. Thomas waved back, heart full but quiet. On the walk home, Laura slid her arm into his. "You made that happen," she said. "We did," Thomas replied. "No," she smiled. "You carried the heavy part." He didn't answer. He just looked ahead, the morning sun warming his face. Later that day, with the house unusually still, Thomas took a moment for himself. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the same old mug, chipped on the side. The birds were chirping gently, and the breeze felt kind. He looked out at the street, at the sky, at nothing in particular. And then something inside him softened. He thought about all the days he had shown up without thanks. All the nights he had gone to bed worried, but with love in his heart. He thought about the scraped knuckles, the long bus rides, the skipped meals, the quiet sacrifices. None of it made the news. No one would write books about it, but it mattered. It mattered deeply, because being a father, especially a middle-class father, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the little things, the everyday courage, the silent resilience, the endless giving without ever expecting anything in return. That evening, Emily felt better and joined her parents at the table. They laughed about small things. Laura lit a candle even though the lights were working. "Just to make dinner feel special," she said, and it did. Thomas looked around the table, at the half-full plates, the gentle smiles, the soft flicker of the candlelight. And in that moment, with nothing flashy and no applause, he felt rich, truly, deeply rich. Not in his wallet, but in his soul. He was a middle-class father, and his love, his effort, his endless quiet strength was the story no one told. But tonight, that story had been felt. And maybe, just maybe, that story would stay with you as you close your eyes. So breathe slowly now. Let your mind rest. And remember, sometimes the quietest lives are the most meaningful ones. Good night. And thank you for listening.